Okay, good evening, everybody, and you're all very welcome to this, the penultimate of our lectures this year from the Dante Public Lecture Series. And I'm really, really delighted to welcome this evening's speaker, Dr. Serena Vandi. Now, Serena is currently a lecturer at Manchester University. Before that, she held a research fellowship at the University of Oxford at St. Hugh's. And before that, again, she did a PhD at the University of Leeds, a wonderful PhD on Dante and Carlo Emilio Gadda. For those of you unfamiliar with 20th century Italian literature, Gadda is one of the most important 20th century writers, and perhaps Italy's closest writer to our own James Joyce because of his kind of linguistic experimentation and things. And she published this wonderful book. I recommend it heartily to all of you, Satura Verità per Verità in Dante e Gadda, and this was published a few years ago and really is a wonderful work. Anyone who works in Italian studies has been aware of Serena for the last number of years. She does tremendous work in and around the area of Dante and reception studies. And she, with colleagues, she formed and established the L'Ombra Sua Torna, Dante il Novecento e Oltre, a number of conferences and publications based around these things. But what I wanted to mention this evening, which is something I don't do very often, but I'm glad to be able to do it this evening because it's been kind of kept under wraps. It's been a big secret for a number of weeks or months, is that Serena next summer is going to be taking up a lectureship in Trinity College in Dublin. And I'm really, really delighted to be able to announce this because it'll be a great acquisition for Trinity, and it's a really great thing for Italian studies here on the island of Ireland to have an Italianist like Serena here working with us. And we hope we'll be seeing a lot more of Serena over the next few years. I should also say, that I'm really intrigued by the title of her talk this evening, Cosmic Dante, Beginnings and Endings in the Commedia. And we look forward to this. But usually I ask you to kind of welcome our guests, because welcome to UCC, and give them a round of applause. But can we just congratulate Serena on winning this lectureship? And it really is a wonderful piece of news. So well done, you. So, without further ado, Serena.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much, Dara, for your very generous introduction and for this delightful invitation to the Center for Dante Studies in Ireland and the Italian Department at UCC. And all of you who are online, thank you for being here. So as you can see, I copied the cover of my book here, just to repeat myself. But there is a reason, and I'll explain it now briefly. So this image is formed by two images. One is Gustave Doré's, it will be clearer later on Paradiso 31, and one is a drawing by Carlo Emilio Gadda, the 20th century author that Dara just mentioned, whom I'm working on. And this is an illustration included in his philosophical treatise Meditazione Milanese meditation, and it represents the limits of our knowledge. And this relates with the topic of today. But before dealing with how I started thinking about this topic, I would like to start with a quotation by Italo Calvino, a famous quotation from his text Cominciare e Finire, about beginnings and endings of texts. And I always put the English translation here. Unfortunately, this is my translation. I could have, but yeah. So Calvino says, l'inizio è il luogo letterario per eccellenza, perché il mondo di fuori per definizione è continuo, non ha limiti visibili. Studiare le zone di confine dell'opera letteraria è osservare i modi in cui l'operazione letteraria comporta riflessioni che vanno al di là della letteratura, ma che solo la letteratura può esprimere. So I became interested in beginnings and endings because of this reason, because they are borders of the text, and being the borders of the text, they have a particular status of being in between the text and what is the non-text, what is outside of the text, and make us reflect upon the text itself, upon literature. I started thinking about this topic, as I said, during my PhD. Then that work wasn't included in my book, and then I went on studying beginnings and endings in Gadda only, but with a look at Dante. And I published that work. Now I'm looking at Dante, so I'm taking back that topic, which was too vast to be included in the book. And I put Gadda here, even if I didn't want to mention Gadda this time, but I had to, because the idea for looking at beginnings and endings in Dante came from Gadda. So this is an example for those of us who work in reception studies of how working in the reception of Dante can give us some new perspectives on Dante, on the original text. So in this case, we have the opening of a collection of essays by Gadda on Italy, on work in Italy, and he's representing in this particular piece the work of butchers. The piece is entitled Una mattinata ai macelli. It is the opening piece of the collection, and it strangely opens with this reference to constellations, which does not make actually sense in that text. So signs chase each other on the zodiac track. Scorpio already grabs the fugitive Libra's pan. The city voracious buyer attracts to its indefectible market agents and merchants of pigs, intermediaries, butchers, and venerable herdsmen. And this sounded to me a bit Dantesque, because Dante famously opens a lot of the cantos of the Purgatorio, the second cantica of the Commedia, with these references to the constellations, most of the time animated, like in Gadda's case. This is not a direct quotation, but it has some sense of Dante in it. And as I argued elsewhere, in all of the collection, Le Meraviglie d'Italia, Gadda kind of puts some references to what can be recognized as Purgatorio, not directly, but that, according to me, adds a layer of eternity, of afterlife to this perspective on very earthly activities. This is to say, so I was thinking about this, for example, an example from Purgatorio 25, the opening of Purgatorio 25. Ora era onde il salir non volea storpio, che il sole aveva il cerchio di Merigge lasciato al Tauro e la notte allo Scorpio. So these constellations chasing each other. So I started thinking about cosmic beginnings and endings. What does it mean? What I mean with cosmic openings and endings? All these references to astronomy, but in general, a broadening of perspective, and a reference to very large coordinates, both temporal and spatial. And this happens a lot in Gadda. And in Gadda, that represents the idea, what he calls awareness of complexity. So according to me, by putting these references, especially at the borders of the text, Gadda tries and remind us all the time that the system of reference, the frame of reference for us is always infinite, is always very big. And this aligns with his aim of all-encompassing reality within his text. And this was part of my comparison between Dante and Gadda, using the term satura, which recall it's the original name of satire, but it's also a form to say saturation, something full, because Dante and Gadda have both this aim, and Dante in particular in the Commedia, of all-encompassing a whole infinite system in their texts. And I started thinking about beginnings and endings of cantos in the Commedia, and seeing if these, for example, these openings in the Purgatorio have other occurrences elsewhere in the Commedia, and what function could they have apart from the literal, actually, the first layer of meaning to refer to the time of day when the action happens in that particular canto. just Daira introduced Gadda already. This is Carlo Emilio Gadda. He was born at the end of the 19th century and died in 1973. He's the author that can be most compared to Joyce for his experimentalism. And this is the original drawing about this limit of knowledge, which for Gadda is always in relationship with the infinity of reality. And in his philosophical work, he tries and reflect on how we can actually grasp the infinity of reality. And that curiously coincided in my mind with that illustration by Doré, which is very famous, of the heavens in paradise. And I thought that that could be an image for what I was saying, the all-encompassing aim, which is made of an urge for knowledge in both authors. First of all, I mentioned the term cosmic. On Dante's astronomy, there's a very important book by Alison Cornish entitled Reading Dante's Stars. And in her introduction, she says something very interesting on the fact that these astronomical references, which for commentators are particularly complex, and hence also for readers, these references are actually not a decoration, they are structures of Dante's text, part of his work, and they are in being an origin of interpretation, a form in their complexity, some figures that must be interpreted. They represent a form of relationship between the writer and the reader, and they ask the reader to interpret, to engage in reading, in the same way in which, in the Middle Ages, they thought the universe could be read as a book. So she compares this famous topos of the universe as a book with the use in Dante of astronomy, which was one of the most important sciences, which led to theological, was very close to theology itself. And I was interested in this focus on the choice, on the ambiguity, the fact that the reader had to choose an interpretation. So they are a place of ambiguity, and the items of astronomy are actually both unalterable, abstract, and sensible, concrete. They are part of our reality, but they're so distant to us that they seem closer to the object of theology. Speaking about beginnings and endings of cantos, we should also reflect on what a canto is. Of course, this is a too long discussion, but just to give you an idea, there were debates upon the status of the cantos in Dante's Commedia. Contini famously said that a canto is a useful didactic opportunity to introduce the Commedia, but actually it's not so important as a division. Whereas Fubini replied, well, cantos were divisions decided by Dante. Dante thinks by means of the terza rima and by cantos, so we should consider the cantos as units. And Beransky more recently focused on the canto as a microcosm for the whole of the poem. So Beransky reflects on the title of the Commedia as the term that could best include everything in it in order for Dante to be able to change the tradition from within. And the canto would be in little the microcosm for the whole of the poem, a unit which is both open, because it's not linked to one particular theme or episode. Some are not, but it's also a closed structure because it's recognizable, it is a division, there is the final verse, so it is a section. On beginnings and endings, there are multiple studies, some only on beginnings, some only on endings. For example, there is very famous Blasucci's categorization of beginnings between diegetic and mimetic beginnings. So there's a typo. And then more recently, Coppo used the Blasucci's categorization for the endings of the canto. There were some comparisons between cantos and canzoni, the poetic form canzone by Camboni, for example, and also Baransky. Juliana Damo studied beginnings and endings in the Western literary canon, and she studied also the Commedia, the beginning and ending of the poem as a whole. And she reflected on the fact that nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai is the first relationship between the I and an encyclopedic and vast dimension. And then more recently, Carrai and Seriani. Seriani warned us, and this is what I don't want to do today, not to create systems and categorizations, not too much at least, because of course Dante teaches us that not everything is so systematic in his work. And so he finds some what he calls marche iniziali, something that is typical in beginnings in the cantos, but we should not overimpose, of course, a systematization, a categorization on the texts. So this is my the openings and endings that I found that I thought could be grouped together as cosmic in some way. Of course, this is debatable. Of course, this is not a categorization because, as we'll see, they're all very different from each other. But I thought it could be an idea, as also I did for Gadda, to put them together and see if they give us something more in being at the beginning and ending of a canto, these cosmic references. You can see the majority are in Purgatorio, and I already showed the first example. There are periphrases to tell the time in Purgatorio, mostly. And then we have 6 in Inferno and 6 in Paradiso. I also included the first canto of the comedy because I think that this is an attempt of trying to see where they're distributed. There's no pattern, but there are some instances that are noteworthy because they come right before particular sections of the Commedia, such as the Empyrean and the Heaven of the Fixed Stars in the Paradiso, the beginning of the action, a new section of Inferno, and then the very particular personal cantos of the Berators for Dante, before and after those very lively and comic cantos and very personal. And right before the door of Purgatory, after Anti-Purgatory, before the last section and before the Garden of Eden. So there are some noteworthy points, but I cannot say, well, this is a pattern of cosmic beginnings and endings. I just tried. And of course, here in yellow, you can see the particular beginnings of the Cantiche and endings, you know, that all the Cantiche ends. So these are the examples, the kind of functions we'll see. The Cantiche all end with stelle, the term stelle, stars, with different meanings. In Inferno, they emerge to see the stars, physical stars. In Purgatorio, they are, he's now prepared, Dante, to climb onto the stars, in that case, the stars in Paradiso, so more metaphysical stars. And then the love that moves the sun and the other stars, and these are the stars even beyond the Paradiso. We are in the Empyrean, in the mystical moment where Dante is one with God and the same origin of the stars. As Peter Dronke notes, this is a reply to Virgil, most likely, because Virgil ended the first and the 10th eclogue with the word umbra and also the Aeneid. So Dante used the opposite, the light, as the ending of his text and not the shadows. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita is also, when I mentioned Giuliana Damo, she notes the famous pairing of the first personal pronoun and the we found ourselves. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, I find myself. And this is a link between the personal experience of Dante the Pilgrim and also the writer and the vast perspective that from the beginning of the poem we are warned is the frame of reference. This poem is about that has that perspective, not just the perspective of the protagonist, and they're always linked. This is an example of cosmic thresholds, the links. So the link between either a realm of the afterlife and the earth, or the different realms. In this case, we have the beginning of Inferno 2, where Dante represents himself as the unit, the individual who undertakes this journey, compared to the rest of the human beings who are on the earth doing their activities. I also put here, but I won't have time to linger on that, another Gadda's text to the beginning of another collection by Gadda of short stories, La Dalgisa, where he has this similar overview of all the activities of human beings seen as from above. And in this case we have lo giorno se ne andava, toglieva gli animali, the other human beings che sono in terra dalle fatiche loro, e io soluno m'apparecchiava a sostenere la guerra. This is the beginning of the action, actually the canto before the beginning of the action. And here we have links at the end of the cantos in Inferno, a couple which are very similar, where Virgil urges Dante to walk, ma seguimi oramai, ma vieni omai, because they have to walk, and Dante stops for some reason. I won't do the paraphrases of everything, but just to note the type of ending. And what does Virgil do? He refers to the constellations, the sun outside of Inferno, because Inferno is dark, and they are. It's an after. We are in the afterlife. We are under, beneath the earth, so there is no time, no sun, no light. And Virgil refers to the earth and says, for example, but follow me, for it is time to move. The fishes glitter now on the horizon, all the way is spread out over a chorus. Only beyond can one climb down the cliff. So there is this first link between the afterlife and the earth. And also in Purgatorio, similar expression, vieni omai, vedi che tocco meridian dal sole, alla riva copre la notte già col piede morrocco. So there's this link between the afterlife and the earth. But in Purgatory, the situation is quite different, as we will see in a moment. Another kind of cosmic perspective, or very large, broad perspective at the beginning of cantos, is in similes. Dante, simile is a rhetorical structure that Dante uses throughout the Commedia, which I studied in depth in comparison to Gadda, as a strategy that they both use to represent the links which form reality. Reality is made of relationships, and metaphor is not the way for Dante. There are, of course, a lot of metaphors in the Commedia, but the simile, making explicit the link between two different things, kind of shows the reader that everything is linked in this system. And of course, it is also a didactic strategy for the only writer that is trying to give us an idea of the afterlife, to tell us how it is, of course, with references to the earthly images, for example. In this, and often the similes are at the beginning of cantos, not always. We also have very short one-line similes in between terzine, but at the beginning of a canto, you can see very lengthy, and this is, I think, the longest one, very lengthy similes that create a whole different scene, which stands by itself, and only at the end of the scene, so the reader is quite confused because the canto begins with a totally extraneous scene, and then you have this was like my situation here. And here we are in very comic cantos. Dante was chased by the devils, and we are in the middle of Malebolge with the Malebranche devils. The canto 24 starts with in quella parte del giovanetto anno che il sole i crin sotto l'acquario tempra e già le notti al mezzodì sen vanno. A very sweet representation of a morning. There's the peasant and who exchanges the brina with neve. And this is a whole representation that is meant to represent a change of mood in Virgil. I won't quote all the studies about this. Of course, this is very debated, but the perspective is this one. after all these very lively cantos, Dante starts this new canto with this very quiet and large perspective of the sky and the peasant. So it's a movement of zooming out that he does very often for many reasons. In this case, a narratological reason of change of pace. And this is another example in the Paradiso, which is an introduction to the last theological discourse of Paradiso. And we have this comparison between the time he spent looking at Beatrice and the time in which the moon and the sun are at the same time on the horizon. So a comparison which serves the representation of an instant of time. But again, at the beginning of the canto, we have Quando ambedue li figli di Latona, with all the mythological references, as long as both Latona's children, sun and moon, take, when covered by the Raman scales, they make their belt of the horizon at the same moment. So another broadening of the perspective, just to focus then on the gaze of Beatrice. Another typology is in the Purgatorio, these astronomical references which mean the time of day. Why? Because the Purgatorio is the only realm where they can actually see the sky, the sun, dawn, sunset, stars. It's very physical, and it's the only realm where there is an actual time, because it's not eternal. Inferno and Paradiso are eternal, Purgatorio is not. So in Purgatorio, time has a theological, eschatological, not only is concrete, there is the passing of time and Dante can actually experience it, but in the Purgatorio, it has a theological meaning. The souls there stay there for a certain amount of time, which is prescribed, and then they are saved. So this is key for Purgatorio. And of course, the reference to time becomes very important. And it is a lot of the time, most of the time, at the beginning of a canto. In this case, Purgatorio 2, Aurora, so we are at dawn. I won't read all of them, but I underline in bold the use of già. Già is like the Latin iam, is the temporal reference which gives us, and Dante uses it a lot, the idea that we are in the middle of another situation, another time, and he's describing this new situation at the beginning with this very long astronomical periphrasis. Già era il sole all'orizzonte giunto, le cui meridiani cerchio coverchi a Gerusalemme col suo più alto punto. And here we have another important point. Why does he refer to Jerusalem here? Because another recurrence here is that he always refers to the other hemisphere, the hemisphere of the earth where he's writing the comedy. Whereas the Purgatorio is on the opposite hemisphere. So he continuously draws links between the two hemispheres because they are linked in the rules of Purgatorio, because, of course, these souls continuously refer to the earth and the importance of prayers coming from the earth. And this is a link which is an actual foundation of the poem and of this idea of salvation. And he always uses this big, very large link between the earth and purgatory. Here we have Era già l'ora che volge il disio. Here we have a representation of the exile, similar to the beginning of Inferno 2, and a representation of the sunset when, and the emotions of a person who is in exile, like Dante in that case, feeling homesick. Here we have La concubina di Titone Antico, again the use of già and the representation of la notte, but the representation of the night is preceded, actually starts with a reference to the dawn, the moment of dawn, because there's always this shift between the two hemispheres, and you have to pay attention to the verbal tenses to see if he's speaking about now when he's writing or then when he was walking. Another threshold, the beginning of Purgatorio 15, to represent the evening. nell'ora che non può il calor diurno intepidar più il freddo della luna, the moment right before dawn, when he will have a dream and he will enter the last section of purgatory. And again, Purgatorio 25. Here there is also the reference to the urge to proceed that we found in Inferno. Purgatorio 27, il giorno sengiva come l'angel di Dio lieto ci apparse. They're all at the beginning of the cantos. And for example, in this case, we are right before Eden. So the very last section of Purgatorio. In the present case, we were right before the last terraces. So in these cases, we are also in strategic points of the Cantica. These are two different cases, but I decided to include them anyway. The end of Purgatorio 8, when actually the reference to the astronomical reference to the sun will not have rested 7 times within the bed that's covered and held fast. This reference is used for a prophecy directed to Dante, but it is conveyed by means of astronomical references, and it is at the end of the count. And I think that this adds on the power of the image and on the prophecy. And here, at the end of a political speech, we have the reference to, again, the whole of the cosmos, chiamavi il cielo intorno vi si gira, mostrandovi le sue bellezze eterne, e l'occhio vostro pura terra mira, onde vi batte chi tutto discerne. So this is a contrast between men who always look on the floor, whereas all the beauty is the eternal beauty created by God is vast and above them. I also included the beginning of Paradiso 1, because at the beginning of Paradiso 1 we have la gloria di colui. It starts with la gloria di colui che tutto muove, so God, and the explanation that this glory is spread out throughout the universe in different ways. So the Paradiso starts with this, again, zooming out, and this large perspective of how the universe works. It is created by God, it derives from God, and from God, everything is differentiated. But this is a special case, like the beginning of the Commedia as a whole. That as I said, I just want to give you an overview of these cases to compare them together, and also to have maybe a discussion together if it makes sense to put them together like this without analyzing, because I don't have time, each of them. This is another case which is very interesting, and it is the backward glance at the end of Paradiso 22, where Dante looks back and lists, and list is another peculiar strategy in the Commedia, which I compared to God as well, and lists with the use of anaphora. Col viso ritornai, vidi la figlia di Latona, sostenni, vidi, m'apparve, mi fu chiaro, mi si dimostrarono, so the centrality of the sense of sight. And he looks back at the journey that he has now almost, he's in the middle of the journey, but he looks back before entering the heaven of the fixed stars. So one of the last sections of the Paradiso, he finished his journey in the heavens of the planets. And there's a list of everything that he has seen right at the end of the canto to sum up his experience before entering this totally new and different environment. This particular zoom from the perspective of Dante is the backward glance analyzed by Teodolinda Barolini, not in thresholds, but in the middle of cantos. And another couple of examples, which I put there, even if they are not actually thresholds, because they are in the middle of cantos, but they can be linked, they are the same thing, in very strategic points. We have this shorter list of what Dante has experienced so far in Paradiso 17, so earlier, in the pivotal canto where he receives by his ancestor Cacciaguida the investiture to tell everything that he has seen in the afterlife. And so he resumed, giù per lo mondo senza fine amaro, e per lo monte del cui bel cacume gli occhi della mia donna mi levaro, e poscia per lo ciel di lume in lume, ho io appreso quel che s'io ridico, a molti fa sapor di forte agrume. So he summarizes everything and he says, when, if I tell everything, someone will get angry. And Cacciaguida replies, you don't have to worry about that. You have to tell everything. So this is essential canto for the Commedia as a literary work. And another backward glance we have in another moment of prophetic investiture in Paradiso 27, when St. Peter himself tells Dante, you will have to tell everything. And again he summarizes, da l'ora che io avea guardato prima, ivi dimosso me per tutto l'arco che fa dal mezzo al fine il primo clima, sicch'io vedeva di là da Gade il varco folle d'Ulisse, e di qua presso il lito nel qual si fece Europa dolce carco, e più mi fora discoverto il sito di questa aiuola, ma il sol procedea sotto i miei piedi un segno più partito. So in this case we have also again the link between questa aiuola, so the little perspective of the earthly perspective of human beings, and what Dante had the opportunity to see, that infinite perspective that he gives us as readers with these summaries in the middle or at the end of cantos. But this idea of listing and gathering all together these experiences, I think that goes well together with the other kinds of openings and endings, as it is that same broadening of the horizon and reminding us of, and himself of, the perspective that this poem has. Another instance is this reference to the depths, which are actually also lengths of the coordinates of Dante's experience. At the end of Paradiso 29, he said, there's, vedi l'eccelso mai e la larghezza dell'eterno valor, poscia che tanti speculi fatti sain che si spezza uno manendo in sé come davanti. So l'eterno valore is God, and now Dante is starting to be able to see the larghezza, the infinity, and larghezza has also a meaning of goodness, that is the essence of God. And at the entrance, and this is another strategic, as I showed in the pattern at the beginning in the schematic representation of distribution of these openings and endings, at the entrance to the Empyrean, we have this reference, this image, which is a beautiful image. But actually what I underlined is this, apart from the force, which gives this idea of uncertainty to all this beautiful image, which I won't comment upon, but is really beautiful. Forse 6.000 miglia di lontano ci ferve l'ora sesta, e questo mondo china già l'ombra quasi al letto piano, quando il mezzo del cielo a noi profondo, and profondo means here high to us, the sky is very high, comincia a farsi tal che alcuna stella perde il parere infino a questo fondo. So he measures, as Anna Maria Cavacci Leonardi says, he kind of measure the distance between the high sky and us as human beings in questo fondo, which is kind of has also negative connotation. And what is describing? The moment when the stars are giving the way to the sun, the night is finishing, and e come viene la chiarissima ancella del sol, aurora, così il cielo si chiude, and this is beautiful, il cielo si chiude di vista infino alla più bella. All the lights are off gradually. But this idea of a noi profondo infino a questo fondo is again a measure of the distance, of the coordinates that Dante, at the beginning of this strategic new section of the Paradiso, the only real Paradiso, let us remember, because the Empyrean is the only real Paradiso. All the rest is just a display for Dante and for us, who can only learn da sensato, with our senses. We cannot understand the simultaneity of the Empyrean. And now Dante is starting to represent something which is really difficult to represent, of course, because time and space are simultaneous, and it's something that is not human. And And so he gives us more and more these large coordinates in which he's working. This is again not a threshold, but I wanted to put it together to this idea of depths. It is the first image of God in the last canto, the unity, God as one and many. And again, he uses the word profondo. Nel suo profondo, vidi che si interna, legato con amore in un volume, ciò che per l'universo si squaderna. So the variety, which is the object of the Commedia, and which is our reality, is one in God. And he was able to see that. And God is profondo. So there's also this recurrence of profondo as something that is distant from human beings, but which Dante can reach now at the end of Paradiso. And this is again a threshold, but I didn't put it in the list, paradoxically, because it's not at the beginning the reference to fondo, but actually this is a declaration of ineffability at the beginning of Inferno 32, a similar situation where at the end of Inferno, of course, similar, not really, because Paradiso is really difficult to represent, Inferno is less so, but at the end of Inferno, the representation becomes more and more difficult, and he declares at the beginning, with a rhetorical device of ineffability, that he does not have the words to represent this, and to represent what? To descriver fondo a tutto l'universo, to represent the depth of all the universe. So this is the perspective that we have to keep in mind always. Some reflections, theoretical reflections on this. So these perspectives, these coordinates, Mikhail Bakhtin, talking about Dante, said that in the comedy is a vertical world where everything, according to medieval philosophy and theology, everything is linked to God. And so there's always this vertical, which can also be represented by a simile, for example, that represent the world as depending on that point, which is God. And the urgency of the poet is to represent everything as synchronous and simultaneous and linked to God. Actually, I would say in the comparison with Gadda, of course, I'm comparing Middle Ages and 20th century, but I would say that more than vertical, of course, vertical here as an ethical and theological meaning, but what Dante is representing is something tridimensional, and he always reminds us that this is his perspective. And I think that putting these references at the borders of the text amplifies this warning and this establishing by part of Dante of a whole system, which his poem reflects, wants, aims to reflect. Speaking of beginnings and endings, Claude Duché, in Idéologie de la mise en texte, sorry, there's only the French that I'll try and translate. He talks about like we saw with Calvino, the beginning and ending of a text as complementary parts, as borders. They're both borders. And they're so interesting because they are they're like the first and last words before and after what he calls déjà là du monde, what is already there, reality. And then there's the text. So there are places of negotiation between the writer and also the reader, between what is reality and what is the text, and how the text can enter this reality, and what is the relationship between this text and reality. What I argue for Gadda is that when he puts these cosmic references at the end of the beginning of his texts, either sections or entire novels, is because he kind of mimetically he plunges his text in the cosmic, really cosmic perspective that he always has. So, as you saw in the description of the activity of butchers, he wanted to refer to the whole cosmos, and this happens all the time. And by putting these references at the border of the text, is kind of saying that the text is concretely, literally in communication with this big perspective, and it has to. So it's a porosity of the text in conjunction with reality, but in the relationship with reality. We cannot say the same for Dante. Dante's system is closed, is very well organized and controlled. It's not reality as it is represented by Gadda. But I think that, again, in the thresholds, to put these large perspectives is for Dante, again, to give us the idea of an all-encompassing text that is in dialogue with reality and, most importantly, the whole of reality. This is the only text that actually aims to represent the universe as a text and kind of, yes, mimetically inscribe itself by means of these thresholds in these large perspectives, in this large system. So in conclusion, to me, these openings and endings, and as I said, some exceptions that can be grouped with them, are not a system, of course. They're not, we cannot find a pattern. But in these strategic points, and especially some of them, they are reminders of the frame of reference of this poem. They are a strategy of control, of narratological, rhetorical control that also respects and goes always beyond the prescriptions of rhetoric, medieval rhetoric. They define the text together with the context, and the context is the system that Dante establishes with this same text. He describes the universe by means of the Commedia, and by means of these thresholds, he reminds us that this Commedia is the representation for the first time of this all-encompassing reality. So again, a link between the universe as a book, as also Alison Cornish pointed out in her works on the astronomy. There is, of course, always an ethical meaning to this, not only verticality, but multidimensional reference and links to these cosmic perspectives. You saw the reference, the cosmic reference within a prophecy, within a reference to how human beings are too much focused on earthly things, like Dante at the end of Purgatorio when he repents, and that perspectives, like the stelle at the end of each cantica, are warning that that should be our perspective, and that he has a theological and ethical mission and meaning in the Commedia. As I said, narratological functions, symbolic functions. The simile of the Villanello has multiple symbolic functions together with the cosmic reference. And finally, yes, the all-encompassing aim. So when Dante puts on the thresholds of his cantos these references to the large perspective of his system, he's more than in other places telling us that his aim is exceptionally all-encompassing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Now let's just stop sharing the screen, shall we? Are we back normal now? Have I stopped sharing the screen?
Yeah.
Should I stay here?
No, yeah, you stay here. Okay, wonderful. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. I mean, if you want to read more on this, obviously you've got to buy the books after that. It's a right riveting read, as I say, but it really is a wonderful book. Now, there's a lot to kind of unpack what Serena was talking about there. So while people are thinking about their questions, and not looking at anyone in particular, but I'm really fascinated by this idea of cosmic. These cosmic thresholds as kind of structuring devices. But if you kind of take it away from the kind of cosmic, and I really like what you're talking about, looking back. The first simile in the Commedia, in Canto 1, which is something which performs looking back. Come quei che con le affanato uscito fuori dal pelo si volge you know, that one there. Si volge all'acqua perigliosa, and così l'animo mio che ancora fugge si volse eretto e rimarrà lo passo che non lasciò già mai persona viva. And you have this is the Canto 1 as a canto which is obviously a canto which is setting up the entirety of the Commedia, but that simile is really flagging something very important. It's a failed corto andare, it's a failed journey, and it's And I was wondering, did you just kind of, does that fit in at all with what you're talking about there? About the, because I mean, I noticed that those references to looking back, which are very positive, and looking back on the journey that he has taken. But there is an injunction throughout the Commedia up until the time you get to the Paradiso that don't look back,
Yes.
look forward. You know, going into purgatory, do not look back. And there's obviously the kind of classical Eurydice reference or Lot's wife from the Bible. So looking back is not always a good thing.
Yes, that's really an interesting question. Well, when we talk about the first simile of the Commedia, we should always think about Ulysses, I think, because the shipwreck reminds us of Ulysses, the person who desired to see too much, and he ended up tragically, as Ulysses himself tells us in Inferno 26. This looking back is safe, I'd say, for Dante at the end of the Paradiso, because he's now purged his sins in Purgatorio. He's now with Beatrice and then St. Bernard. So first of all, Dante compared it to Ulysses, had guides, accepted guides, followed a path. So it's a looking back that actually can all encompass, because it has an order, it is within an order and accepts it. And actually also the backward gazes are always in form of lists, so something orderly. So I think that this is the comparison. And another thing I was thinking about is that at the end of the canto about the Indovini that are punished by looking back, whereas on earth they were looking too far forward. At the end of that, there is a closing where Virgil urges Dante and says, "Let's go." So there's here the opposition between looking back and looking forward. But these gazing backwards is at the end of Paradiso, I think, meaningfully, because he's ready now.
Yeah. Wonderful. Questions. And we include our friends online as well. If anyone wants to just raise your hand online. Are there questions? Well, as I think people are probably thinking about them, Dario has a question. Dario, as you know, you're going to have to stand up or come over here for your question.
Genuine question. And it's not even clear to me, so Serena, sorry if I'm not making sense. But so you were talking about thresholds, and you were meaning thresholds, I would say, in a textual point of view, as the elements that really engage the reader and let them into the text. But I think we are more used to see these passages as just openings or endings or just astronomical periphrases. Someone would say even non-poetical, like Croce would say that they're not really poetry.
They're structural.
Yeah. So my question would be, what, besides the textual understanding of thresholds, what does it mean to really think of these passages as thresholds from a poetic point of view or from a narratological point of view? Like, do they also, because thresholds encourage changes, probably, so they, like the liminal, the in-between brings the person who experienced the situation to go forward. So I think it's very interesting to read them as thresholds, but can we also read them as thresholds not only in a textual point of view? Is it,
yes, like as narratological steps.
Yeah, as poetical, like do they mean something else rather than just being positioned there?
Yes, I think so. Thank you for your question. That made me think of Barolini's reading of the beginnings in Inferno as Poetica del Nuovo, so the obsession of Dante with new events, things, change of sceneries, and this is a narrative strategy. For example, speaking of narratological devices, the simile of Lo Villanello is being read as a narratological device of change of scenery by Maldina, for example. So yes, there were studies about and these are interesting also, about the intercanti, the space between cantos, which is very interesting, becomes very interesting between the penultimate and the last canto of the Paradiso, because there's the introduction to the prayer and then the prayer. And so there's like a pose performed by the space between the cantos. And so I think there are multiple layers to be investigated. And also, I hope not to be ingenuous by reading these thresholds, and this could be, I could be led in this by the comparison with Gadda, in reading them too much with a modern outlook, because of course we should, and that's why I put also the studies about the canto as a unit. So what Dante wanted, we should reflect on what a canto is if we're talking about thresholds. Are they beginnings and endings in the same way in which Nel mezzo del cammin and L'amor che muove il sole are beginnings and endings? I think this is interesting. But we should. There are multiple layers to be investigated. Thank you. I hope this answered.
Elsina, become.
So, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture.
Speak up, some people.
Yes. I was curious to know if you have made some reflections about the visionary aspect of the poem, about the threshold and ending and beginnings. I was thinking about references to sleep. Tant'era vien di sonno a quel punto, at the beginning of Inferno 1. And then Bernardo, when he's urging Dante, fugge il tempo che t'assonna, eccetera, to be quickly, because the time, this time of, we don't know, of this sleep, but it's not clear if it's a simile or it's effectively referring to genuine sleep. So just, I was curious if you had investigated a bit on this visionary aspect of the thresholds.
Thank you. I haven't, but it is very interesting, because of course the threshold, in being in its status of being in between known text and text, it is a place in which the writer can play with these different dimensions. And for example, Gadda does so and reflects on this in the Meditazione Milanese, on the very moment when we wake up and we are not actually nor asleep nor awake, and this liminality of dimensions, I think, is reflected in the endings of La cognizione del dolore and del pasticciaccio, these two main novels. Actually, the pasticciaccio, sorry, the first version of the finale that has just been published, not the official one, which is interesting to see because it presents this liminality. And I was thinking about also Stefano Carrai's article on beginnings, not only in Dante, but also in 20th century authors. He focuses on poetry, and he says that, of course, it was a topos, the inspirational. So in the beginning, to put the start of poetry as a moment of inspiration. And so in the first verse, this movement of inspiration from outside. So maybe an entrance into another dimension. I haven't investigated, but it's really interesting. Thank you.
No. So I have a question about Aiuola, because it seems like that is the image of the smallness, of narrowness, of the opposite of a cosmic perspective in a way, even though it's experienced as part of this cosmic perspective. And that image, that word itself, always seemed quite confusing to me. What's Dante trying to get at? And all the commentators all seem really quite confused about what that is. And you get this idea, maybe it's a Boethian image of narrowness, of this sort of very small, solid earth that is visible, that is not submerged in the water, that kind of thing. But then you've got the biblical imagery, and the sort of threshing floor imagery, and then there's some people who interpret it also in the romance of Alexander, those kind of narratives in all kind of strange, seemingly strange to me at least, ways. So all kinds of images that just need small spaces, a flower bed, a seed bed, open courtyard, threshing floor, or even a blank space on a page. That's from Scott's article on what Aiwala is. So I don't know, just it's such a seemingly confusing but also interesting image to represent the smallness.
Yes.
Of the image. I just wondering.
No, I haven't thought about it, but yes, it's really strange image to use. But in these examples, it requires this also further meaning of narrowness in relationship with the list of the experiences in this more like in this larger perspective that Dante had. So maybe it's used in opposition. I don't know if the choice was in opposition with the image of garden, and the aiuola is even smaller than the Garden of Eden, for example. But I'm just trying because I haven't thought about aiuola. But in these cases, it's in opposition. It creates this opposition between narrowness and breadth. Sorry,
no, it's just interesting for me, to think, what is aiuola then, and what is the opposite of what are the images of the breadth, the expansiveness. If you can think of aiuola in so many different ways potentially.
Yes,
times,
it acquires its narrowness in its being a small garden. I think we should think about it in comparison with the image of the garden, which is topical in many ways, but also as compared to these perspectives as a place in which we're all concentrated without looking at the breadth of the rest of the universe, which for Dante has an ethical meaning. It's not just a landscape, a backdrop we have to contemplate. Sorry, I don't have much.
No, it's fine. I mean, I don't have an answer to you either. Something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you, Aisha.
Also, I'm just thinking there about. I mean, obviously, there are many other types of threshold in the Commedia. They're not all cosmic.
No. I made them
so
look like a system.
But well, certainly very convincingly. But I was wondering, is there a relationship though with other forms of kind of liminality or other kinds of thresholds? I mean, if you take, for example, say something like Dante really marks these as this is we're now entering into a new thing. So take, for example, Canto 18 of the Inferno, it luogo è in inferno detto malevolge. It's very kind of it's kind of signaling it off, and we are now in a different thing. You go past the gates of purgatory in Canto 9 and Canto 10 is again this another wonderful moment of transition, but without the kind of cosmic. And I was wondering, is there a relationship between the cosmic and the non-cosmic, or are they somehow, as structuring principles, do they dialogue with one another? I mean, I suppose being like kind of a further way of looking at it, or are they all just separate kind of entities, if you like?
I think they are, since there are many different categories of thresholds, and these are a minority. There must be a dialogue of some kind in different points with different meanings. They can be grouped. Yes, I agree with you with these representations of the system of the afterlife that Dante is introducing to us, which is the frame of reference, at least within the narrative of the poem, which then is also furtherly enlarged with these more cosmic references. Another category is the simile, not the cosmic one, but the simile in general, because the simile, when it starts with a long simile, there it starts with a link between, at least usually, the earth and the afterlife, or mythology and tradition. And so another scene which is completely heterogeneous compared to the narrative, and then introduces the narrative as if and this is of course a narratological device to keep attention by the reader, but as if the start of the action must be linked to the scenery, for example, of the pitch of the barattieri, the arzanate veneziani at the beginning.
The extended simile of the boatyard.
Yes.
That's a wonderful simile. And I mean, I think I'm really glad you talked about simile, because I think people pass over similes, kind of okay, similes, and that is very good, and there are 660 similes in the poem or whatever, but they function almost. Some of them do. Some of the more important ones function almost like an address to the reader, because it is in a way Dante's way of kind of keeping his reader with him, because he's giving them the image of something that they are familiar with.
Yes.
And this is from our world. Now I'm going to tell you about this other thing. So it is without doubt the kind of prime narrative tool that Dante is employing throughout the Commedia, and I think it really is fantastic. I'm really glad you brought it up, because I think similes, because there was a lot of work done on them in the past, people have tended to kind of, well, we've already done that. I think we should be going back to them and kind of unpicking them and looking at them differently.
Yeah, and they're fun. Richard Lansing talked about the
Yes.
simile as like a mimesis of the learning process. So Dante is giving to us the process he underwent while looking at this new scenery, and so that we can have a similar experience of learning something.
I use the comparison over metaphor.
Yes.
And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
People kind of get that. Wonderful. So I'm just checking there. I don't think there's any questions online. Dad, just put out the question, but there doesn't seem to be anyone. Do we have any other questions in the room before we let Serena off the hook and take her for a beverage somewhere? Okay, we'll let her off the hook, shall we? Now, just to let you know, then next week we're going to have our final lecture of the series, and I know that's a very sad thing for a lot of you. What else and how else are you going to fill your Monday evenings? I don't know. That's up to you. So we can set up a support group if it's really needed, you know. But just to say that next week's speaker is Professor Nick Haveley. Nick Haveley is a very eminent Dantista. He's written several books, from medieval studies, Dante and the Franciscans right through to 19th century reception studies, and he's got a new book coming out with Oxford University Press. And we are going to be the first really to hear about some of the research he's been doing on 19th century travelers in Dante's Italy. So the title of his lecture next week is Dante's Mountains, 19th Century Travelers. So that's something that we should all look forward to. But please join with me now in thanking Serena for a quite wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
And we will see you soon.
Yes, I'm happy.